Hi, I'm Dr. Marilyn. Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Emotionology. If you are a parent who is struggling with a teenager, this one's for you, my friend. I'm going to help you to stay out of jail. But first, why? What are we doing on this channel? Well, on this channel, we explore how emotion science shapes achievement, leadership, and family life. And that's why today, this one is for you. Not as an abstract theory, just pulling from a book on a shelf, but as lived human experience. Our conversations are rooted in my latest book, Emotionology, from Aristotle to AI. In this book, I use emotion science data and translate it into real life insights. As I alluded to a few minutes ago, today's conversation is one that many parents and their children will immediately recognize. So, is your teenager getting on your last nerve? Been there, done that, friends. And I survived. I did not go to jail. So, emotion science can help explain why it seems like your adolescent is getting on your last nerve, my friend. So, parents, we often say, my child was never like this before. My teenager changed overnight. Suddenly, there's an attitude, there's resistance, there's silence, there's defiance. How did this happen? So as parents, we start asking ourselves all kinds of questions. But the main question is what I just said. What happened to my child, my baby? What happened to my baby? Well, my friend, emotion science tells us that what you are seeing may not be rebellion at all. Emotion science is going to help you to interpret that. And that's what we're talking about in today's episode. But if you're a regular viewer, you know by this point in the program, we read a little bit from the book. Today, we are actually reading from section 11.3. It's in part 2 of the book. Part 2 talks about emotionology and human life. And in section 11, we focus in on parenting of adolescence. So section 11.3 is entitled Adolescence as a Regulatory Inflection Point. What does that mean? Simply put, you already know the meaning of that. This is when your child starts to really try you. So, let's read a little bit. Rather than resetting earlier patterns, adolescents stress test what is already in place. They trying you. Affective patterns, that's with an A. The feeling patterns that were established earlier. Remember when your child loved you? Let's read on. Affective patterns that were established earlier in the family system are often amplified under strain. And when they get amplified, when they get bigger, they reveal where regulation has been stable and where it has been fragile. In other words, you have rules and regulations in place, but some of them were not cemented deep down to the point that your child wouldn't try them. And I read further. What appears as a sudden change is often the system responding to heightened load because those babies are experiencing things away from the home. So they are having a heightened load of emotions that they have to respond to. So that's not introducing a new structure. It's just putting more weight on the existing structure. And I read, patterns that previously functioned adequately under lower demand may suddenly become insufficient. Suddenly you're not the wonderful parent that you thought you were, or even that they thought they were, because they have other lived experiences that they're bringing to the family. And this is not because your systems were faulty, but because they were never designed to carry this level of complexity. In other words, we didn't know what our children would encounter outside of the home. This is why talking to your child is so important. Last part of the reading. Misalignment or misinterpretation during adolescence is frequently misread. That's why the title of today's episode is what? What's happening to my child? Help me to stop killing this child. Heightened sensitivity to shame may appear as withdrawal because they have other things to compare it to now. And this will increase, while increased, let me read it, while increased orientation towards pride or hope may appear as defiance. In other words, they are responding to shame because they're comparing themselves to others, and then they are developing a lot of pride in addition to hope. But pride is a switch hitter. If you order an emotion science data profile, I explain this in the profile. Pride can be positive fuel, or pride can be negative or protective fuel. So they have an increased orientation towards pride or hope, and it might look like defiance. Last sentence. In these moments, behavior is often interpreted as oppositional when it could be regulatory. In other words, my friend, it looks like they just want to do the opposite of what you want from them. But there are ways to regulate it so that the adolescent still has a sense of self in their other worlds outside of the family, and you as a parent stay out of jail. So, as you know by now, in every episode, we talk about the lived expansion. How do we take stuff from the book and expand it into our lived experiences? First, let me start by translating what I read even further into everyday language. First of all, parents, remember, you were a child once. Whew, some of us were children in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we didn't have any kind of technology to record what we did. And some of us are saying, thank goodness. But that's where I want to start with the lived expansion. We were children once. What did we do that got on our parents' nerves? Need a moment? Exactly. Maybe we talked back. Maybe we just shut down because we didn't want to hear it. Maybe we tested the boundaries just to see how far we can stretch them. I know I did, and I know my kids did. Now, you are the parent. So, sometimes it feels like you are getting what? Payback. And you know what they say about payback. So, that moment when you look at your teenager and you think, where did this attitude come from? Emotion science suggests something very important. Many of the patterns we see during adolescence are not new patterns. That's why I'm asking you to remember when you were a child. They are patterns that were already forming earlier in the family system. Those little things like when the babies play one parent against the other, or whether we see something and we're like, oh, I'm not going to say anything. These patterns were already forming. They are simply being amplified under pressure when your baby becomes an adolescent, just like they were when we became adolescents. So, this is why a lot of people often would say, you're just like your mama. You're just like your daddy. What they are noticing is not personality alone. They are noticing patterns that developed within the family system. Now, I'm not saying that you're responsible for what they are demonstrating now, because remember what I said earlier. We have patterns within the family system, but now as adolescents, they're getting more exposure outside the family than at any other point in their lives. So, what's happening? What's happening has a simple term: general influence. So, families pass down many things across generations, but our children also get these same things from outside of the family that were passed down from their friends' families over generations. In particular, values, habits, beliefs. There's a story that you may have heard where a young lady asked her mom why they cut the ends off of a ham every time they cook a ham during the holidays. And the mother said, I don't know, I'm going to ask your grandmother. And Mama went into the living room, because all the family was together for the holidays, and asked the grandmother. And the grandmother said, I don't know. Thankfully, great-grandmother was still there. And great-grandmother said, well, when I was a child, we had a ham and it was too big for the pan that we had. So we had to cut off the ends. So for generations, they were cutting off the ends of a ham that could fit right into the pans they had. But they carried this trait because it was passed down and nobody explained it. And that's where adolescence becomes turbulent, because we're getting values, habits, and beliefs as an adolescent, not from our own family, but from other people's families, our friends. So emotion science plays a pivotal part here. It shows that interpretations of experience are also passed down. So not only are we passing down the values, the habits, and beliefs, we're also passing down how we interpret them, how we understand them. This ham, nobody ever passed down the interpretation. They just passed down the habit. If somebody had interpreted it, then the next generation would say, oh, we don't have that issue because it fits in our pan. You see where I'm coming from? So, it's crucial to understand how these interpretations go along generation after generation. How a family handles pressure. How a family responds to shame. How pride is expressed. Is it usually expressed positively or negatively? How hope is encouraged. How are we encouraged within ourselves as parents, and how are we demonstrating that to our children? Adolescence begins the moment when those patterns are tested under greater demand. Until our children go out into the world as adolescents, they don't really have a real test within the family. So, as an adolescent, here are some ways that they are tested, my friend. School expectations increase. Social environments expand. And now, with social media, these social environments are global. When we were growing up, it was on the block, in the neighborhood, within our extended family when we go to grandma's house. For our adolescents today, they are global. Autonomy is growing because with our devices, we now have so much that we can do alone that we really don't even need to talk to anybody. We have an app for that. And then we have AI. And of course, everybody is giving AI a bad name. But as humans, and I talk about that in later sections of the book, as humans, we have a responsibility to how AI is infused for ourselves, for our children, and in the broader society. So, what else is our adolescent dealing with? Well, the system, all of it together, is now operating under a greater load. And when this happens, my friend, the patterns that once work, they no longer hold. They worked under simpler conditions. But when the conditions start to begin to get complex and interconnected, they don't work anymore. So, these generational influences, we have to find ways to make them hold under diverse conditions, not just under simple conditions. We tell our children, as long as you're under my roof, you're going to do as I say. But we have a responsibility to prepare them for when they are not under our roofs. So, what's the big picture? What's the cultural observation? Well, it's real simple. Family culture also shapes how these patterns unfold. Again, not just within the family, but in a broader context. So, what does that look like? It's real simple. Different families and different cultural communities communicate emotions in different ways. Kind of like when we got used to get a whooping, and then your mama would say, "Don't let me see you crying." Well, you just whooped me, and I can't even express emotions. So, different families, different cultural groups, emotions are communicated differently. Let's go back before the whooping. Some families didn't even whoop. I had friends who said, "My parents never hit me." You may have had friends. Maybe you don't hit your children. I tried not to hit my children after they got to the age of 6 where they could understand. I would talk to them. I started talking to them before age 6. But each family is different. And this is rooted in cultural differences as well. Some families emphasize strict discipline. That's how I was raised. Some families emphasize restraining their emotions, holding back. I know there were times when my younger son would do something before he was 6 and he needed a spanking. At the time I was married, and I would say to my ex-husband when he came home, "So-and-so did so-and-so and you need to go spank him." My ex-husband would go and talk to him and then come back. And I said, "Well, what happened?" And he'd be laughing. "I couldn't spank him because every time I tried, he would make these moves and all I would do is burst out laughing." So that was an emotional restraint because of the comedic response of the child. Some families respond to conflict with silence. Don't say a word. I did that when my children got older. And I would tell them, "Don't worry while I'm talking. Worry when I stop talking." And I also do that in all my other relationships. If I stop talking to you, it means I'm done. So, others, again, instead of silence, they respond with the opposite intensity. They double down, and it's knockdown, drag out, fussing, arguing, all of this. Here's the thing though. Children are absorbing because children are watching. So children absorb. They take in these signals long before they have language to explain them. They may not be able to talk about it, but they are taking in whatever cultural displays of emotion they grew up with within their families. Then you turn around one day and you're living with an adult. You're living with an adolescent. Pressure increases, doesn't it? Yes, it does. These patterns that the child was absorbing before they became an adolescent, these patterns begin to surface in ways that can surprise everyone involved. Like, where'd that come from? Like, what is happening with this child? However, what appears to be rebellion may actually simply be the internal system of the child trying to adjust under the strain of adolescence. And my treasured viewer, if you've seen the previous 2 episodes, you know that at this point, we say, so what? How do we put this all together? Well, here is your integration moment for episode 3. Emotion science does not blame parents. Because if emotion science blamed parents, I would be heavy with blame. Emotion science does not label adolescence as the problem for a parent to fix. Because we cannot fix anyone, not even our own children. So what's the integration moment, Dr. Marilyn? Well, simply put, Emotionology Life helps families to see what is happening inside the system. We do this with a family emotional profile, and then we compare every one of the family members' fuel emotions and protective emotions. How are they connected? For instance, if the mother's fuel emotion is hope and the daddy's fuel emotion is joy, well, when hope goes up, joy can go down. Why? Because hope makes you more internal. You appear more disconnected. Joy is more external. I know in church the sisters be like, can't nobody steal my joy. Well, actually, they can, because joy relies more on external stimulation, whereas hope relies on internal stimulation. So if one family member has the fuel emotion of hope and another one of joy, the one who has joy is going to feel that they are not being paid attention to. That's just a simple example. Now add the children's fuel emotions and you see how emotion science data can help you to interpret overall. So this is how Emotionology Life helps you to understand what's happening inside your family's system. In that way, no matter what happens when your adolescent goes out and interacts with other families' systems and other cultural systems, they will have rooted emotion science data that stabilizes them within themselves. So, adolescence is not a disruption of a system. It doesn't disrupt your family system, and it doesn't disrupt any other family system. Now, some of y'all might say, well, Dr. Marilyn, you must not have seen the children of today. I've worked with the children of today for the past almost 3 decades in the inner cities of America, in 4 states, 10 school districts, and 7 school buildings. I have seen it. In addition, in my private practice, I've worked with families all over the world, not just the United States, but China, India, Canada, different countries in Europe. It is the same pattern for adolescents. They are trying to find a system to anchor themselves. So, adolescence is a stress test for your family system. But if you don't understand your family system, if you're still cutting the ends off that ham, then your children, your adolescents, are going to be just as confused and also doing unnecessary things like cutting the ends off of a ham. So, when families recognize this moment as an inflection point rather than a crisis, when they have the emotion science data and they can use that to say, hey, this is what we see. This is not a crisis. Let's look at our emotion science profiles. Let's look at our correlations. Let's see how our fuel and protective emotions are playing on each other in this moment. Then they can gain the ability to respond with clarity instead of escalation. Then, no, it's not always going to be peaceful. However, understanding the patterns will help restore something very powerful. Choice. In later episodes, I talk about choice with respect to emotion science. Once you can restore choice, your adolescent can go out into the world and not be so influenced because they have a foundation that establishes how to restore their choices to make them healthy, not just for themselves and their family, but also for everyone that they interact with. So what? Well, simply put, families all over can begin to interpret, say that again, families all over can begin to interpret behavior differently. I know that I went through something recently with my children and I got so stuck on thinking the behavior that they were doing to me. I had to use my own theory on myself to remember. I had to get back into the emotion science because it doesn't matter that I have a PhD in this. The same way it doesn't matter that a cardiologist has a bad heart. Cardiologists can't operate on their own heart when it goes bad. So sometimes we have to step back and get some help to remind us. And that's what I did. I used my emotion science data in alignment with my therapist because I said I needed to readjust. So, this is the pivotal moment. Families can begin to interpret behavior differently, respond differently, and stabilize the system in ways that strengthen relationships rather than fracturing them. So what? Hopefully, you now have some scaffold on which to stand the next time your adolescent appears to be getting on your last nerve. So what? So what do we do? Well, if you are a regular viewer, you know what happens now. If this conversation resonates with you and you want to better understand what might be happening inside of your own family dynamics, emotion science and Emotionology Life, and by default, me, Dr. Marilyn, can help. At Emotionology Life, we offer family emotionology profiles like I referred to earlier. These profiles show how your fuel and protective emotions align with those of your adolescent children and everybody else in your immediate household. This profile will help your family to recognize patterns and triggers that influence communication, discipline, and everyday interaction. If you would like to explore this further for your own family, you can learn more and order a family profile through emotionologylife.com. What other ways can you use our services? Well, whether it's through a profile, or whether you want to bring us for your family, or whether you want to bring us into the work environment, speaking engagements, training, consulting, leadership coaching. These are all the ways that I can help you to use emotion science data to enhance your overall well being. Thank you for joining me today, my friend. And like I said, now you can look at your adolescent with different eyes. Until next time, my friend, be good to that child, and above all, be good to yourself.